In this video, I'm going to make this simple jade cabochon ring with wire embellishments using Argentium silver. For the band, I'm going to use 12 gauge, half-round wire. I cut a piece and form it by hand around my ring mandrel, a little bit smaller than the final size. Then I'm going to use a rubber mallet to bend the ends into shape. Then I can slide the ring down the mandrel to get a precise size. With an X-Acto knife, I just make a small scored mark where the ends will line up. And cut. Now I bend the ends so they meet, trying not to distort the ring too much, so it stays as round as possible. To make the joint as neat as possible for soldering, I'm going to take a flat needle file and put it between the two ends. Then I can file both ends simultaneously, and when I remove the file, the ends will be flush. With some final positioning, it's ready to solder. I apply some flux to the joint, get some solder on the pick, and carefully deposit it on the solder joint, making sure to heat both sides evenly so the solder will flow between them. After it's soldered, I go back to the ring mandrel just to make sure that the shape is still nice and round. Next thing is to use a flat file to make a small flat mark on the side of the ring. This is where the bezel will sit. For this ring, I'm using a pre-made 6mm bezel cup from Rio Grande. The links for materials will be in the description. The ring and bezel will be positioned for soldering like this. Here I'm positioning the pieces for soldering. Apply some flux, and this time I'm just going to place a piece of solder in the flux on the bezel cup. I'm heating the flux as gently as possible to avoid dislodging the solder. Once the liquid is gone, I'm going to focus the heat in the band of the ring. Whenever I'm soldering two pieces that are of unequal size, I want to heat the larger one first to avoid melting the smaller one. And done. To clean the ring up, I throw it in a pickling solution for about 15 minutes. After the pickling is done, I rinse the ring in a baking soda solution to neutralize any acid, and then rinse the ring off in clean water. All clean. Moving on to the wire embellishment. This is my first attempt to solder a wire to the bezel cup, and it does not go well. When I'm heating the piece, I put too much heat in the wire and not enough in the bezel cup. So when the solder makes contact, it jumps directly to the wire and does not bridge the gap. Then the wire melts. For my second attempt, I'm going to make sure to heat the bezel cup enough and not overheat the wire. Once I get the piece of solder placed, I can focus on torch control and make sure to heat the bezel cup until the solder is about to melt before heating the wire. And there is a successful solder joint. Now that one end of the wire is soldered, I'm going to bend the wire into shape so I can solder the other end. When making bends like this, it's important to be sure that the bezel cup is stronger than the wire, or else bending the wire could distort the bezel cup. In this case, the bezel cup is, so that makes things easier. I'll just clip off the excess wire. Then it's time for more soldering. Before attaching the next wire, I'm going to clean the side of the bezel cup with a little bit of sandpaper. Now I'm ready to position the next wire to attach to the bezel cup. Flux again. Now I need to be extra careful with how I apply the heat. If I heat the bezel cup too much, I could disrupt the solder on the first wire. This time, I use the solder pick to help guide the solder where I want it to go. The second wire is successfully attached. Now I just need to bend it into position and clip off the excess. This bend is starting a little bit closer to the bezel cup, so I'm going to use round-nosed pliers to support it as I bend, clipping off the excess. When I clipped the wire off this time, I used the wrong side of the flush cutters, so there's a taper on the wire. I'm going to flip it around and clean up the cut, so that the solder joint is clean. Bending it back into position, and it's ready to solder. Flux first, as always. Joints like this, where the wires are the same size, are quite a bit easier. Next wire. I think I've got the hang of it now. Shape the wire like before, but this time I'm going to improve my cutting procedure so that the cut is cleaner from the get-go. Instead of cutting all the way through, I'm going to just mark it when the flush cutters are in position. Then I'm going to pull the wire out a little bit, flip the cutters around, and cut. Then I just need to bend the wire back into place, and it's ready to go right away. The marking step is important because it lets me set the angle to get a good fit. Another straightforward solder joint. Now for the last wire. At this point, I have the process down pretty well, so there's not much to say. Bend the wire into position, and use the improved cutting procedure to remove the excess. And this is the last solder joint. Now all the soldering is done, and all that is left is some filing and polishing, and then setting the stone. Here, I'm shaping the first wire so that it will grow smoothly out of the band. For polishing, I'm using felt Dremel wheels like this one with polishing compound. The last step is setting the stone. The stone I'm using is a 6mm nephrite jade cabochon from Rio Grande. This stone is a tight fit in the bezel setting, so I use the plastic handle of a screwdriver to press it into place. I don't have a ring clamp, but pressing the ring tightly onto the mandrel holds it tolerably well. Just checking to see that the stone is evenly seated, and it looks fine. Now to set the stone. I start by pressing one side of the bezel tightly against the stone, following its contour. And then I do the same thing on the other side. Next, I move to 90 degrees and do the same thing. I've set points on 4 sides, and now I move on to the corners. The last step is to use a curved pressing tool and roll around the edge of the bezel, pressing each point to the surface of the stone.